The dirt was cold. The rope was rough. It dug into her wrists, pinning her to the ground like an animal caught in a trap. Above her, men laughed. Their hands were like claws, tearing at the fabric of her dress. It ripped with a sound like dry leaves crushed under a boot. She begged them to stop. Her voice was thin and useless against their noise. Tears streamed down her face, hot on her cold skin. They wanted her broken. They wanted her quiet. Her cries turned into sobs, but the desert was empty. No one was coming. They called it a medical check, a quarantine. They said they were looking for sickness, a convenient lie to cover their cruelty. The one who called himself a doctor, a man named Hale, held up a small brown bottle. The liquid inside smelled sharp, like acid and rot. He tilted it over a cut on her hip. The sting was a flash of white-hot fire. She screamed, a raw, ragged sound, and twisted against the ropes. But they held her fast. The assistants, two grunting brutes, just grinned and pushed her down harder. "Stay still," the doctor hissed, "or the next dose goes in your eye." They weren't looking for sickness. They were looking for something she had, something she'd die to protect. They sliced away the outer layers of her clothes, their hands greedy and rough, searching every seam, every fold. It wasn't a search, it was a violation. Each pull of the rope, each rough touch, stole another piece of her. The false doctor muttered words like contagion and public safety, but his eyes told the real story. He was a hired dog, and he'd do anything to find his prize. When they were done, they left her there, half-dressed, half-conscious in the choking dust. The desert wind was a razor against her raw skin. The taste of blood and salt filled her mouth. For a long moment, she thought this was it. This was where she would die, and the world would never know why. The horizon blurred. Her breath came in shallow little gasps. Her body screamed from 100 different points of pain. But as her spirit threatened to shatter, a single thought pushed through the fog. Lying down meant death. Walking meant a chance. So she walked. She stumbled through the dry grass, her bare feet bleeding with every step. She clutched the tattered remnants of her dress to her chest, a useless shield against the cold and her shame. Every rustle in the brush, every cry of a distant crow, sent a jolt of terror through her. Their laughter echoed in her mind. Their hands were ghosts on her skin. She kept moving, fueled by nothing but raw, stubborn survival. The sun began to set, painting the sky in colors of blood and bruises. That's when she saw it. A small cabin, a lonely light in the fading world. Her strength gave out. Her knees buckled and she collapsed in a heap by an old wooden well. The rope burns on her arms were dark and angry. She tried to call for help, but only a dry whisper came out. Her eyes fluttered shut. This was the end. She was sure of it this time. And that was the moment Elias Crow walked out of his barn. He was 55, with a beard more gray than black and eyes that had seen too much. They were hard eyes shaped by years of solitude and sun, but deep within them was a kindness born from a pain he never spoke of. He saw her crumpled form by the well, and he froze. It was like seeing a ghost from a life he'd long since buried. He didn't hesitate. He rushed to her side, wrapping his old worn poncho around her shivering shoulders. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing and carried her inside his small, quiet home. He laid her gently on the long wooden table. Her body trembled uncontrollably. A dark bruise was already forming on her cheek. He wanted to look away from the brutality of it, but he knew he couldn't. He had to know. He carefully pulled the torn cloth aside to examine the wound on her hip. And then he stopped. His blood ran cold. The chemical burns, the precise cuts. It wasn't random cruelty. It was a signature he had seen once before, a lifetime ago, a signature that had cost him everything. Her eyes flickered open, pupils blown wide with terror. Her voice was a thread of sound. "They'll come back for me," she rasped. Then her eyes rolled back and she was gone again. Elias stood frozen, the lamplight casting long shadows across the room. The question wasn't if he should help her. He knew he would. The question that tore through his soul was what he would do when he finally came face to face with the man who had ruined his life. The cabin smelled of coffee and wood smoke, a scent of safety that felt like a lie. Elias pulled the poncho tighter around the girl. Her breathing was a shallow flutter, but it was steady. He saw the bruises blooming like dark flowers along her arms and ribs, each one a testament to a story he was only beginning to understand. He moved with a quiet purpose, heating water in a kettle on the old stove. His hands, calloused and rough from a lifetime of ranch work, were surprisingly gentle as he dipped a clean rag into the warm water. He began to clean the dirt and blood from her skin. She flinched in her unconscious state, a low whimper escaping her lips. "You're safe now," he murmured, the words feeling hollow even to him. "You're safe." The kettle began to hiss, a lonely sound in the vast silence. He tore strips of clean cloth and bandaged the worst of her wounds, his knots firm and sure. It was battlefield medicine, simple and effective. He poured 2 cups of coffee, a habit from a time when he wasn't alone, and set one on the table beside her, knowing she couldn't drink it. He sat down in his worn chair and watched her face in the flickering firelight. Years. It had been years since another soul had shared his roof. The silence of the ranch had been his only companion since Martha passed, since he'd failed to protect her. Now this young woman, a stranger, lay broken on his table, hunted by the same shadows that had consumed his past. He felt that old familiar ache in his chest, a ghost of a pain that never truly left. Her eyes opened again, slowly this time. They darted around the unfamiliar cabin before finally landing on him. She tried to sit up, a flash of panic on her face, but the pain was a physical wall that pushed her back down. Ilias held up a placating hand. "Easy now. Don't move too fast. You're hurt bad." Her voice was a raw whisper. "Why? Why did you help me?" He brought the cup of coffee to her lips, letting her take a small sip. "Because a man's got to stand for something," he said, his voice gravelly. "Because no one deserves what they did to you." Her eyes welled with tears, but she blinked them back, a flicker of iron in her gaze. She started to talk. She told him about the monster who called himself Dr. Hale, about his lies of quarantine. She told him how they'd torn her dress apart, looking not for sickness, but for papers. And then she told him about the book, a small leather-bound book of receipts, hidden in the lining of her saddlebag. It wasn't just receipts. It was a ledger, written in her father's careful hand. Proof. Proof that the most powerful man in the valley, Judge Abernathy, had been systematically stealing water rights, bleeding every small rancher dry. Elias listened, his face an unreadable mask. When she finished, the silence in the room was heavy, thick with unspoken history. "So that's why they marked you," he said, his voice low. "They wanted the book." She nodded, her eyes fixed on his. "If they get it," she whispered, "the truth dies. My father dies all over again." The wind howled outside, rattling the shutters like a restless spirit. A coyote cried out, a lonely, mournful sound. Elias stood, his movements deliberate. He took the rifle down from its pegs on the wall, checked the action, and propped it by the door. He slid the heavy wooden bolt into place. He turned back to her, his expression grim. "Rest now. In the morning we ride for the marshal." Her lips trembled. "You don't understand," she said, her voice shaking with a terrifying certainty. "They won't wait. They're coming back. Tonight." Elias froze. The firelight danced in his hard eyes. He knew she was right. These men weren't the type to leave a job unfinished. And as he looked at the burns on her skin, the same burns he remembered from all those years ago, he knew something else. They weren't just coming back for the book. They were coming back to silence the only two people who could connect Dr. Hale's work to the powerful man who gave him his orders. They were coming back to finish what they started with his wife. The wind was a constant moan against the cabin walls. Elias sat by the fire, the rifle a cold, heavy weight across his knees. Across the room, the girl, Clara she had told him her name was, drifted in a fitful, pain-soaked sleep. Every whimper, every sharp intake of breath was like a spur digging into his side. The old clock on the mantelpiece ticked, each second stretching into an eternity. He'd been counting the hours since sundown, his ears tuned to the night, listening for the one sound that didn't belong. And then he heard it, the rhythmic, steady beat of hooves. Not a stray cow or a lone rider. This was a group moving with purpose. The 2 ranch dogs he kept outside barked once, a sharp, angry sound, and then fell silent. That sudden silence was more chilling than any bark. Whoever was out there knew how to handle dogs. They knew how to be quiet. They knew how to hunt. Elias rose without a sound and moved to the small window, peering through a crack in the shutter. The moonlight was pale and thin, but it was enough. 3 riders. They moved slowly, arrogantly, as if they already owned the ground beneath their horses' feet. A knock came at the door. It wasn't loud or aggressive. It was polite, almost conversational. That made it 10 times more menacing. "Evening, Crow," a smooth voice called out. It was a voice Elias would never forget. "Dr. Hale, we've come to retrieve our patient. A bit of a misunderstanding earlier." There was a pause. Another, rougher voice chimed in. "We know she's in there, old man. Open up and we'll make this quick." Elias felt the familiar grain of the rifle stock against his cheek. He didn't answer the door. He called back, his voice steady and calm, projecting a confidence he didn't entirely feel. "This property is under the protection of territorial law. You got papers from a judge. You can serve 'em at sunup, not a minute before." A long silence stretched out, filled only by the whisper of the wind. Then came a low, humorless chuckle. It was Hale again. "The judge? You think the judge is your shield? The judge is the one who holds our leash." The words hung in the air, a confirmation of his darkest fears. Abernathy was behind this. All of it. "Now I'll say it one last time." Hale's voice hardened, the false civility gone. "Give us the girl, or we'll burn this cabin to the ground with you both inside it." Clara's eyes snapped open. She clutched the rough blanket, her knuckles white. "I told you," she breathed, her voice filled with despair. Ilias moved back to her side, his expression unreadable. "Stay down, and stay quiet," he commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Trust me." Before she could protest, he reached into the pocket of his worn vest and pulled out the small leather ledger. For a moment, he just looked at it, the source of all this death and pain. Then he did something she didn't expect. He walked over to the hearth, pried a loose stone from the wall, and tucked the book deep inside the hidden cavity. He replaced the stone just as another, harder knock rattled the door. The book wasn't the prize anymore. She was, and he was the only thing standing in their way. The men outside were no longer waiting. He could hear their boots crunching in the dry grass as they began to circle the cabin. The horses snorted nervously. This was it. The fight he'd been running from for years had finally come to his door. Elias moved with a grim efficiency. He didn't just lock the door. He began to prepare for war. He wedged a chair under the doorknob. He doused the main lantern, leaving the room in a disorienting dance of shadow and firelight. He moved from window to window, checking the worn leather hinges he'd reinforced just last year. Every little trick a lonely, paranoid rancher might devise was about to be put to the test. He returned to the center of the room, the rifle held at a low ready. Clara stared at him, her eyes wide pools of terror in the dim light. "Are they going to kill us?" she whispered. Elias met her gaze, and for the first time she saw something other than quiet grief in his eyes. It was a cold, hard fire, a promise. "Not tonight," he said. And in that moment, she believed him. The battle for the soul of the valley wasn't going to be fought in a courtroom with a corrupt judge. It was going to be fought right here, in this tiny wooden cabin, between one old rancher and the ghosts of his past. The night pressed in, heavy and suffocating. Dust and wind scratched at the windows like desperate fingers. Elias was a statue of gray-bearded granite, the rifle an extension of his arms. Clara lay on the cot, her breath held tight in her chest, trying to make herself disappear into the shadows. Outside, the circling footsteps stopped. The voices dropped to conspiring whispers. They thought he was an old man, alone and scared. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The first move came from the barn, the distinct sound of a metal latch being lifted, slow and careful. A sharp, clear ring cut through the night. It was the cowbell Elias had wired to the inside of the barn door. He was on his feet in an instant, the rifle already shouldered. Through a slit in the wall, he saw a hulking shadow slip inside the barn, the one they called Tad, the loud one. A grim smile touched Elias's lips. The moment Tad was fully inside, the heavy barn door slammed shut behind him. The rope holding it open, sliced by a razor Elias had fixed to the jamb, had done its job. Tad's surprised shout was followed by a string of curses, all of it muffled by 2 inches of solid oak. He was trapped. Another sound. Boots crunching near the side gate by the corral. The second man, Morrow, was trying to flank the cabin. Elias didn't hesitate. He grabbed the smaller lantern from the mantel, lit it, and hurled it not at the man, but into a metal bucket filled with sand and oil he'd placed there earlier. The lantern shattered, and a thick, greasy cloud of black smoke billowed out, instantly obscuring the entire side of the yard. Morrow coughed and sputtered, stumbling blindly through the acrid smoke. That's when Elias moved. He slipped out the back door, silent as a predator. He circled around the smoke, came up behind the disoriented Morrow, and brought the butt of his rifle down in one clean, efficient arc. The crack of wood against skull was sickeningly loud. Morrow crumpled to the ground without a sound. Elias dragged him behind the water trough and, using a length of rawhide, tied his hands and feet with practiced speed. 2 down, 1 to go. Back at the front door, Dr. Hale was no longer sounding confident. His voice was sharp, laced with a new raw anger. "Crow, you old fool! You can't win this! Give me the girl and I might let you see the sunrise." Elias stepped back inside, his heart pounding a steady, cold rhythm. "This is my land," he called back, his voice booming in the small cabin. "She's under my protection. You want her, you'll have to come through me." From the cot, Clara whispered, her voice trembling, "He'll kill you." Elias didn't take his eyes off the door. Worse men have tried. He propped the rifle near the window, a decoy. Then he did the last thing Hale would ever expect. He unbolted the door and stepped out into the moonlit yard, armed with nothing but a coiled lariat. The moon cast everything in silver and black. Hale stood 20 feet away, a long, wicked-looking knife in one hand and his signature brown bottle in the other. His eyes were wild, burning with a furious fire. He was a man used to his victims being tied down and helpless. This was new territory. The two men circled each other, a deadly dance in the dust. The horses watched, their eyes wide and nervous. Elias was all patience, his movements measured and calm. He let Hale make the first move. The doctor lunged, the knife slashing through the air, where Elias's chest had been a second before. As Hale overcommitted, Elias snapped the lariat forward. The loop shot out, impossibly fast, and cinched tight around Hale's wrist. The knife clattered uselessly to the dirt. Hale roared in frustration and rage, trying to bring the bottle of acid around with his free hand. But he'd forgotten about the girl. The cabin door flew open and Clara stood there, holding Elias's heavy cast-iron skillet like a weapon. "Now, Elias!" she screamed, her voice clear and strong. The distraction was all he needed. Elias yanked hard on the rope. Hale stumbled forward, off balance. The bottle flew from his grasp, spilling its burning contents harmlessly into the dust. In one fluid motion, Elias closed the distance, spun the doctor around, and slammed him hard against the thick corner post of the corral fence. Hale cursed and thrashed, but the rope, now expertly wrapped and cinched, held him as tight as any iron shackle. The night was suddenly quiet again. The only sound was the wind and the faint crackle from the smoking bucket. Elias stood, breathing heavily, the lariat still in his hand. He had won. He had faced the monster from his past and he had won. But as he looked at the defeated doctor snarling at him from the fence post, he knew this was only the first battle. Hale was just a symptom. The disease, Judge Abernathy, was still out there. And the ledger, the only proof that could stop him, was hidden behind a loose stone in his wall. Now the question was, what was his next move? Because Abernathy wasn't going to take this loss quietly. The sun climbed over the distant mesas, spilling liquid gold across the valley. The long, violent night was over. Dr. Hale was slumped against the fence post, defeated and silent. In the barn, Tad and Morrow were bound and gagged, their bluster from the night before replaced by a sullen, simmering anger. Clara stepped out of the cabin, the old poncho wrapped around her shoulders. In the clear light of morning, she looked different. The terror was still there, a shadow in the back of her eyes, but it was overshadowed by something new, something hard and resilient. Hope. She walked over to Elias, who was watching the sunrise, his face weary but resolute. They stood together in silence for a long moment, the quiet speaking more than words ever could. It was the shared silence of survivors. After a while, Elias turned and went back inside. He returned a moment later, holding the small leather-bound ledger. He pressed it into her hands. "This is yours," he said. "The proof, and the reason your father died." She looked down at the book, at her father's familiar handwriting, and then back up at the old rancher. "You saved my life," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved everything." Elias shook his head, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "No, ma'am, you saved yourself the minute you decided to get up and walk. I just held the line." But as he said it, he knew it wasn't the whole truth. He hadn't just held the line, he'd redrawn it. He'd finally stood up to the shadow that had haunted him for a decade. He sent his young ranch hand, a boy named Billy, to ride for the nearest town with a federal outpost, bypassing the corrupt local law completely. He told him to ask for Marshal Vance, an old friend from his past, and to speak of nothing to anyone else. As they waited, a strange peace settled over the ranch. The place no longer felt empty. It felt like a fortress that had withstood a siege. Clara, despite her injuries, insisted on helping. She fed the chickens, her movements slow but determined. She helped Elias patch a broken fence rail. The simple, honest work seemed to heal something in her that medicine couldn't touch. They spoke little, but a bond was forming, forged in the crucible of shared danger. But then, a new twist emerged. As Elias was cleaning out the pockets of the captured Dr. Hale, looking for anything that might help their case, he found more than just a wallet and some lint. Tucked into a hidden fold of leather was a folded piece of paper. It was a telegram. The message was short, encoded, but Elias, with his past experience, could decipher enough to make his blood run cold. It wasn't from Abernathy. It was from a powerful railroad baron, a man named Sterling, known for his ruthless expansion tactics. The telegram spoke of a geological survey and mineral rights tied directly to the land currently owned by the small ranchers. The same ranchers Abernathy was squeezing out. This wasn't just about water. It never was. The water theft was just the tool. The real prize was the land itself. Abernathy was clearing the valley not for his own cattle empire, but to sell it, piece by bloody piece, to the railroad. Underneath their feet, beneath the grazing lands and homesteads, was something far more valuable: gold. The ledger in Clara's hands wasn't just proof of theft. It was the only thing standing between a dozen hard-working families and a corporate takeover that would erase them from the map. The stakes had just gotten infinitely higher. The revelation hit them like a physical blow. This was bigger than a corrupt judge. This was a conspiracy, backed by Eastern money and corporate power. Abernathy wasn't the king. He was just a pawn, a very dangerous pawn. Clara sank onto the porch steps, the ledger clutched to her chest. "My father," she whispered. "He must have found out. That's why they killed him. He wasn't just protecting our water. He was protecting the whole valley." Elias stared out at the land. His land. The land he had poured his life into. The land where Martha was buried. He now understood the true, monstrous scale of Abernathy's ambition. He wasn't just stealing water. He was trying to steal the future. "They won't stop with the ledger," Elias said, his voice a low growl. "Even if we get this to Vance, Abernathy and his backers will bury it. They'll buy witnesses, bribe officials. We need more." Clara looked up at him, her eyes searching his. "More? What more could there be?" Elias's gaze drifted toward the barn, where their prisoners were being held. "Confessions," he said grimly. "Hale is a doctor, a man of science, however twisted. He strikes me as a survivor. Tad and Morrow, they're just hired muscle. One of them will break." He walked toward the barn, his steps heavy with purpose. Clara followed, her fear warring with a grim determination. Inside the barn, the air was thick with the smell of hay and fear. Tad and Morrow glared at them with pure hatred. Elias ignored them and walked straight to Dr. Hale, who was tied to a support beam. "The railroad," Elias said, his voice flat. "Sterling, we know." The flicker of surprise in Hale's eyes was all the confirmation he needed. "Abernathy is just your local manager, but men like Sterling don't like loose ends. When this goes bad, who do you think they're going to sacrifice? The judge with all his connections, or the hired doctor with blood on his hands?" Hale sneered. "You have nothing." Elias leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. I have the ledger, I have witnesses, and I have you. When Marshal Vance gets here, you can either be the star witness against a vast criminal enterprise, maybe get a reduced sentence in a federal prison, or you can be the fall guy who hangs for murder. Your choice. He let the words sink in, then turned his attention to the other two. He knelt in front of Morrow, the one he'd knocked out. Morrow was younger, his eyes wide and shifty. He was the weak link. Your partner Tad there, Elias said conversationally, gesturing with his thumb. He's already talking, trying to cut a deal. Says the whole thing was your idea. Liar! Tad shouted from across the barn. Morrow's eyes darted between Elias and his partner. The seed of doubt was planted. He says you're the one who killed Clara's father, Elias pressed, his voice like ice. Said you staged the accident. That was a bluff, a wild guess, but it hit its mark. Morrow's face went pale. No, he stammered. No, that was Hale's idea. And just like that, the dam broke. Morrow started talking, the words spilling out of him in a desperate torrent. He confessed everything. The intimidation of ranchers, the staged accidents, the murder of Clara's father. He confirmed the gold, the railroad deal, Abernathy's role. It was all true, and it was all worse than they had imagined. But then, Morrow revealed one final, terrifying twist. The plan was already in motion. Abernathy wasn't waiting for the ledger. He had a team of surveyors backed by a private army of railroad thugs arriving in 2 days. They weren't coming to negotiate. They were coming with eviction notices and guns, ready to claim the entire valley by force. Marshal Vance wasn't riding to a crime scene. He was riding into the opening salvo of a range war. The confession hung in the dusty air of the barn, a death sentence for the entire valley. 2 days. They had 2 days before Abernathy's private army arrived. Marshal Vance and his handful of deputies would be walking into an ambush. They had to get word to him, to warn him. But the nearest telegraph office was a full day's ride in the opposite direction of the federal outpost. It was an impossible choice. Warn Vance and let the army arrive unopposed, or ride for help and hope Vance survived the trap. We can't split up, Clara said, her voice firm. That's what they'd expect. She was right. Elias looked at the terrified, blubbering Morrow and the stoic, calculating Dr. Hale. He had the truth. He had the confession. But it was useless if they were all dead. He needed a plan. A crazy plan. Billy, Elias said, turning to his young ranch hand who had been standing guard. You know the old miner's path through the Spirit Canyon? Billy's eyes went wide. Yeah, but, boss, that trail ain't been used in 20 years. It's treacherous. It's also the one place they'll never look for you, Elias countered. It cuts straight across the Badlands. It'll get you to the telegraph at Rock Ridge by morning. I want you to send 2 messages, one to Marshal Vance. Tell him Abernathy's surveyors are the vanguard. Bring the cavalry. The second message goes to the San Francisco Chronicle. Tell them Railroad Baron Sterling implicated in land grab conspiracy and murder in the Verde Valley. Proof is on its way. It was a massive gamble. Alerting the press could either bring the whole corrupt enterprise crashing down or paint a giant target on all their backs. But it was the only play they had left. As Billy saddled his fastest horse, Elias and Clara faced their own grim reality. They couldn't just wait. They had to slow Abernathy down. The other ranchers, Clara said suddenly, they won't believe us. Abernathy has them all terrified. They'll believe proof, Elias said. He looked at Dr. Hale. And you, Doctor, are going to help us provide it. His new plan was taking shape, and it was even more dangerous than the last. He wasn't going to wait for the war to come to him. He was going to take the fight to Abernathy. That night, under the cover of darkness, they rode out. Not toward safety, but toward the heart of the beast, Judge Abernathy's sprawling, fortified ranch. They took Dr. Hale with them, bound and gagged on a spare horse. He was their unwilling key, their Trojan horse. Abernathy's ranch was a fortress. High walls, armed guards on patrol. A frontal assault was suicide. But Elias wasn't planning an assault. He was planning an infiltration. He knew from Morrow's confession that Abernathy was hosting a private poker game tonight with the very ranchers he was planning to betray. It was an act of supreme arrogance, a final toast to their ruin, and it was the perfect opportunity. They left the horses tethered in a ravine and crept toward the compound. The main house was ablaze with light, the sound of laughter and music drifting on the night air. "The guards patrol in pairs," Elias whispered, his eyes scanning the perimeter. "They switch every hour. The east wall has a blind spot near the old oak tree." Clara looked at him amazed. "How do you know all this?" Elias's face was a grim shadow. "Because the man who built this ranch was a friend of mine, before Abernathy stole it from his widow. Another ghost from the past, another debt to be paid." They waited, their nerves stretched taut until the patrol passed. Then they moved, slipping over the wall like shadows. Their target wasn't the main house. It was the small doctor's office Abernathy had built for Hale on the property. According to Morrow, Abernathy kept a safe in that office. A safe that contained not just his own copy of the ledger, but geological maps, contracts with the railroad, and letters from Sterling himself. The original ledger was proof of theft. What was in that safe was proof of a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of power. They forced the terrified Dr. Hale to open the door to his own office. Once inside, Elias worked on the safe, his rough fingers surprisingly deft with the lockpicks he produced from his boot. Minutes felt like hours. From the main house, a burst of loud laughter echoed across the yard. The poker game was in full swing. Finally, with a soft click, the safe door swung open. And there it was, a stack of papers that could bring down an empire. But as Clara reached for them, a new sound froze her blood. The crunch of boots on the gravel path right outside the office door. They weren't alone. The door swung open, and Judge Abernathy stood there, a smug smile on his face and a pearl-handled revolver in his hand. And behind him stood the one person they never expected to see, the local marshal, grinning like a wolf. The trap hadn't been for Vance. It had been for them. "I must admit, Crow, you're more resourceful than I gave you credit for," Abernathy said, his voice smooth as poisoned honey. "But you should have stayed hidden. This valley was forgetting you." The marshal nudged Dr. Hale with his pistol. "Looks like your patient found you, Doc. Time for a final treatment, I think." It was over. They had walked right into the spider's web. Abernathy stepped aside, revealing two more of his armed thugs. There was no escape. But Elias wasn't looking at Abernathy. He was looking past him, at the main house. "You made one mistake, Judge," Elias said, his voice calm and steady. "You assume the men you're robbing are cowards." Abernathy laughed. "They're broken farmers. They're nothing." "No," a new voice said from the doorway of the main house. "We're neighbors." It was Old Man Hemlock, one of the ranchers from the poker game, and behind him stood a dozen more, their faces grim, armed with hunting rifles and shotguns. Clara had done more than just follow Elias. While he was picking the safe, she had slipped out the back window of the office. She hadn't run for help. She'd run straight into the lion's den. She had burst into the poker game, thrown her father's ledger onto the table, and told them everything. The stolen water, the gold, the railroad, the army of thugs that was on its way to evict them. She had gambled that their pride was worth more than Abernathy's whiskey, and she had won. Abernathy's face contorted with rage. The standoff was a powder keg, his 4 guns against a dozen angry ranchers. But before anyone could fire a shot, another sound cut through the night, the thunder of hooves, a lot of hooves. It wasn't Abernathy's army. They weren't due for another day. A column of uniformed men rode into the compound, rifles at the ready, led by a tall man with a silver star on his chest. Federal Marshal Vance. Billy's message had gotten through, but there was another twist. Vance wasn't alone. Riding beside him was a journalist from the San Francisco Chronicle, his eyes wide, scribbling furiously in a notepad. The story was already out. The trap had been sprung, but it had caught the wrong animal. Abernathy, his face a mask of disbelief and fury, raised his pistol. But he never fired. A single shot cracked from the darkness, and the pearl-handled revolver flew from his hand. Elias stood with a smoking pistol, his aim as true as it had been 20 years ago. The fight was over. Justice, real justice, had finally come to the valley. The sun rose on a new day. Judge Abernathy, the local marshal, and their web of conspirators were in federal custody. The story, splashed across the front page of the Chronicle, had sent shock waves all the way to the coast, sparking an investigation that would ultimately topple Sterling's railroad empire. The valley was safe. The ranchers, united by the crisis, formed a new council, ensuring that no single person could ever hold such power again. Back at his ranch, Elias stood by the small, weathered grave marker under the old cottonwood tree. Clara came and stood beside him, placing a small bouquet of wildflowers on the grave. "This is Martha's," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. "She would have liked you," he said. "She was a fighter too." The silence between them was no longer filled with shared danger, but with a quiet, comfortable peace. The ranch didn't feel lonely anymore. It felt like home. In the days that followed, Clara stayed. She helped Elias rebuild, her spirit healing alongside her physical wounds. The ledger, her father's last will and testament, was now a historical document, a symbol of their victory. The pain of the past would never fully disappear, for either of them. But in the ashes of their shared trauma, something new was beginning to grow. A partnership, a friendship, and maybe in time, something more. They had faced down the darkness together and had come out the other side, not unscathed, but stronger. There's a lesson in this story, a truth as old as the hills. Evil thrives in silence and isolation. It preys on the belief that you are alone. But when one person has the courage to stand up and another has the courage to trust, they create a light that can't be extinguished. They remind us that we are all connected and that standing for what is right is never a burden carried alone. What would you have done in Elias's boots? Would you have barred the door, or would you have opened it to a stranger in need? Do you believe one person's courage can still change the world? If this story of grit and justice resonated with you, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. It ensures these tales of the untamed West keep riding, and you won't miss the next chapter. Because every frontier holds its secrets, and every soul has a story worth fighting for. Thanks for listening.